thank you all for being here this morning. Welcome. As many of you know, I started getting really interested in how children learn to read about 7 years ago. It actually started with college students who were telling me about their reading problems and took me back down into elementary school to look at how children were being taught and why so many kids were having a hard time. And I started to realize that there was a group of people who knew a lot about this, a particular profession that really gets what it takes for a child to learn how to read. What is this profession? Who are these people? They are speech-language pathologists. Speech-language pathologists specialize in evaluating and treating speech and language difficulties. And what speech-language pathologists really understand are the connections between speech and reading, between sound and print. And they understand why reading difficulties are often rooted in difficulties with language. And they know what to do about it. They know how to help kids. So our guest this morning is one of the nation's most prominent speech-language pathologists, in my opinion, Dr. Julie Washington. Julie is a professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. She is a fellow of the American Speech-Language Hearing Association. She directs the California Learning Disabilities Research Innovation Hub at UCI and the Language Variation and Academic Success Lab. I first met Julie back in 2018 in Mississippi. I was on a reporting trip, and she was there too. We were observing the state's efforts to help more teachers and college professors learn about the big body of research known as the science of reading. I heard Julie talk about her work on that trip in Mississippi. I later interviewed her for a podcast episode. And when I started working with Planet Word on this speaker series, I knew that I wanted to bring Julie here. Her research focuses on the intersection of literacy, language variation, and poverty in African American children in particular. I have learned so much from her over the years, and I am really thrilled she could be here today to share her work with all of you. Welcome, Julie Washington.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I like to move around, so I have a lavalier, and I will try not to fall off the stage. I am very happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation, Emily. We met in Mississippi, and every once in a while somebody's like, have you ever had anything happen to you that was really embarrassing? Yes, about a year later, actually. We met again at IDA, and we spent like 3 days together in Mississippi. And I walked up to her at IDA and introduced myself. And she said, you know, we spent 3 days together last year in Mississippi. I'm like, oh, yeah. And it's not because she's not memorable. Many of us in the audience know why I didn't remember a year later. Something that happens as you get a little older is you're like, oh, I'm so sorry. Life's most embarrassing moments. But I'm happy to be here and talk about something that is near and dear to my heart. As Emily said, I'm a speech-language pathologist. And when we talk about reading, we are in a place now in our understanding of reading where we know language drives everything, that reading is really a language skill. And so language supports it in really significant ways. And as a speech pathologist, we've always had a good sense about language and reading, because if you have children who have language disorders, one of the areas that they struggle in is reading and writing. And you will very seldom find a child who's language impaired who says, English is my favorite subject, or anything that's language-based. And so we understood many years ago that reading and writing were really language on paper, but not really always how it works. And I personally believe that when we talk about reading now and in this movement and time where we're talking about the science of reading, that theoretically, People understand that language is the basis, but how to use language to support reading, I really don't think that teachers understand yet. And so that is the next frontier in the science of reading, is to get us beyond this word level thinking about vocabulary and sound level thinking about phonemes and phonology, and get to the point where we're really talking about text integration, and that will get kids to reading comprehension. And so some of that I'm going to talk about today, because we're working on that with an intervention that we're piloting in Oakland, getting this sort of integration piece. And so that's where we're headed, I think, in reading. We're just not there yet. One of the places I'd like to start is the idea that we are, this acronym that the American Psychological Association came up with is WEIRD. Weird research. And research is weird. And the acronym WEIRD stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. That's where most of our research comes from. These are the nations that are really producing the work that we do. And so when we think about these nations that are producing the work that we are relating to, they account for 12% of the world's population, but 80% of the research participants. And so most of the work that's been done in reading and a lot of language is being done in the United States, Australia, England, in places where we're using samples that are middle income to upper middle income. They're white, they're rich, and they don't represent most of the world's population. And so that's what we're working with. I always start with this because it has driven a lot of what we know, and it drives some of the things that we're now trying to overcome in research with children who are growing up in underrepresented and minoritized populations. So weird research results in narrow sample pools. One of the things that we find in research is that a lot of the populations we need to know the most about are the ones who are least likely to participate. So the samples that we have are convenience samples a lot of the time. So the research that we have had historically is with populations who volunteer or professors' kids, because they have to volunteer. My kids have been in a few studies, and so they are willing participants. But these convenience samples mean that a lot of what we know about language and about reading has come from kids that it's not really always being applied to. One of the best examples of that, I think, is some of what we know about late talking. And so there's this research about late talkers, and late talkers are kids who don't produce their first word till they're 2.5, 3 years old. And a lot of the work on late talking came from these convenience samples. And so if you think about that, and some of the findings were that most kids will talk. 80% of kids will talk even if they're late talkers. They will talk without intervention. Okay, that might be true of professors' kids or these upper middle class kids, but we had pediatricians telling kids who are growing up in poverty, who don't have the same kinds of resources, the same kinds of opportunities, telling their parents they'll talk when they get ready. No, actually, they probably won't talk without intervention. And so that's one of the things that happens when we're talking about research that's not really representative, that it's hard to generalize that kind of research. I'm going to step down so I can actually see. Can I walk down here? Yeah. And then I won't fall. And so the lack of diversity in these samples is a concern, not just because there aren't certain looking people in a sample, but that the outcomes don't generalize to a lot of people. So this weird research that without representation results in culturally biased expectations. And so there are expectations that did not include these populations when they were set. That's one of the things we're really seeing in our language research. I believe it to be true in reading research. It's really important when you think about standardized tests. And so what we see in our standardized test samples is, we mirrored the census. And so we have 6 black kids in it. and then we generalize it to everyone. And so when those kids aren't doing well on the instrument, we believe the instrument instead of looking at the kids and thinking, maybe this instrument isn't appropriate. And that's one of the things I do in my lab. In fact, we're working on an instrument that is more able to reflect the competence of kids instead of just their performance on standardized instruments. And so this is not a small issue because it perpetuates inequity. And so we look at what kids are doing on these instruments and we say they don't have this skill, and that's actually not true. Typically a lot of kids do have this skill, but it's not being accessed in a way that's appropriate. And so this focus on weird research, I think, is really important as a foundation and a starting point for thinking about what it is that we're doing with children who come from different backgrounds when they come into our classrooms to learn to read, to write, and to just learn. Perhaps we need to be doing things differently. And one of the things and this is not what I'm talking about, one of the things I hear a lot when people talk about being culturally appropriate is books where, the people in the books look like you. Well, that's important. It's important if you're brown or black or, from different backgrounds for you to, or have a different family structure for you to see that in books. But that's not the only thing that's important. It's important that the book reflect your values, your culture, that it reflects more than just the way that you look. And last week I participated, or sometime, I have no sense of time anymore, but because I'm moving around so much, but I participated in a virtual town hall, and there was a young man who participated who had dyslexia. He was very creative. He was an artist. I was very impressed by him. But one of the things that he said was, I have dyslexia, and he's a storyteller. I have dyslexia, so my stories are not linear. They are scattered and all over the place, and that's the way he saw himself. And one of the things I was sure to say to him was, most of the world tells nonlinear stories. This is not just because you're scattered, but the people who are doing the research tell linear stories. They go from the beginning to the end. You know what? That's not how we tell stories. Black people don't tell stories that way, and a lot of other cultures don't. And so when you hear African American kids telling stories, it's like, once upon a time, I went to the hospital, and that hospital looked just like the one that my grandmama was in. And when we went to see her, she was sick. Oh, and then when I went to the hospital, and you just keep going in and out. They call them, they're called topic-associated narratives. So you go in and out, and eventually, if we're lucky, we'll get to the end. But, but those kinds of stories are actually more common than linear stories. But we're led to believe that being linear is a story grammar structure, and so that's what we teach. And it comes from weird samples. It comes from samples where that is true for the people who were involved. And remember, they only represent 12% of the population. The rest of the population is doing what this young man did. He thinks it's impaired because he thinks it should be linear. And my response to him was, au contraire. You think that it is impaired because you weren't represented in these samples. So this is really important. It really has influenced what we do. And so we end up with these benchmarks in reading research that none of them make sense to me. A lot of them just really don't make sense. The language and reading guidelines are based on, and expectations are based on these sort of cultural disconnects. They're not culturally informed, and they lead to these educational standards that don't necessarily generalize to most kids. And, I think Emily might know that I'm one of these anti-third grade people, where third grade is like a magic grade. I'm like, why? Why is it so magic? The national data shows us that most kids aren't reading by fourth grade, so why is third grade magic? It's like we made it up. And now it is something that drives our curricula, it drives our national testing, it drives everything. And yet we know that as a standard, most kids aren't meeting it. And perhaps I'm the person who says the standard is the problem, not the kids. Because if everybody's not meeting it, then why is it the standard? And so we could go on, and we can go on and on about that in the Q&A. But I'm the person who challenges those things. But despite how weird research is, it's what we have. It's what we have right now. And so one of the things one of my colleagues says, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, is that weird research is what it is. She studies English learners. What we know, the benchmarks we have, the expectations we have are what we have. And so we have to work with them. And so we have to think about those expectations and benchmarks with additions. So they're the foundation of what we know, but we have to think beyond them. So when we start thinking about the additions, we have to think about things that we know what we know. This is what weird research tells us, but some of the additions are socioeconomic status, level of education, culture, language variation, all of those things that will influence what happens with reading and are not included in the research base. We are trying to include them in the research base in an asset-focused way, because one of the other things that can happen when you use this kind of research is that this research becomes the prototype and everything else is compared to it. And when it comes to kids who are low income, it becomes this subtraction approach. This is what it should look like. This is what these kids should be doing. They're not doing any of that, so they're not performing as well. And so we're always focused on deficits. That's what we're trying to get away from. Those kids have assets too. I do not compare low-income kids to middle-income kids because the answer is always the same. Middle-income kids are doing better. No, low-income kids are doing different. That's my response. They're doing things differently, and we need to understand those. Okay, now I'm going to move on. So this is my favorite definition of reading. It's so simple. Perfetti and Morone in 1995, learning to read is coming to know how one's own writing system works. The child has knowledge of language already. When kids come to school, they are language users. They come to school with the language of their communities. They are experts in those languages. They have the statistical properties of those languages. They think in those languages. Whatever it is your community is doing, that is what you're doing when you get to school. So you have that knowledge already. And when you came into the world, you were already wired to learn language. So as long as the people in your community are talking to you, you are going to learn to use language, unless you have an impairment. But typically developing kids will learn language in their community because they're wired for it. We are not wired for reading and writing. So when kids get to school, it's the writing system that they have to learn and how the writing system encodes your language. So it starts with your language and moves toward reading and writing. That's the argument I'm going to make for African American kids, because we have not allowed that. We have not allowed African American kids to use their own language system to support reading and writing. And as a result, I think we're contributing to the problem when we think about the struggles with reading. This is also a study that I think is really important. And this is something that, this is Jessica Montag and Mary Ellen McDonald, who's also coming here. And Mary Ellen and Jessica study syntax, the sentence level, and complex syntax. And this study is important because one of the ways that we talk about language and reading is how language supports reading. And what this study says is reading also supports oral language. So if children are not learning to read, we're not seeing them develop the complexity with oral language that they should have. Because what they found in this study, they compared databases of adult discourse. And so there are all these databases out there that have adult speech that's transcribed. They took some of those samples, they looked at children's books, and what they found was that complex structures like relative clauses occur 3 times more often in books than they do in oral language. So kids are not learning relative clauses from listening to us doing them. They're learning them from reading books. And so the consequence of not being able to read is not just in being able to read text, it's in the development of the oral language system. You learn vocabulary from books, you learn sentence structure from books. So language drives reading, but reading also drives language. So the message is, in the early years, language development drives reading development. About 8 years old, according to this study, because it was with kids between 8 and 12, about 8 years old, reading starts to drive language. So this relationship is not unidirectional. It's not just if you have strong language, you'll be a good reader. It's also if you're a good reader, you'll have strong language skills. So in the absence of being able to read, we see kids' language also suffer. And so it has greater consequences than just for reading text. Weaknesses in language produce weaknesses in both reading and writing. I talk about language all the time, and Hugh Katz called me on it. So I added this slide. He says, it's not just language, it's other things. I'm a speech pathologist. It is just language. However, I will talk about some of these things as well. So social emotional learning really matters. Anybody who works with kids who are traumatized know that it influences how you learn and certainly how you learn to read. Motivation and engagement are discussed a lot, and people are studying it a lot more. I tend not to like the word motivation, even though I know it's important, because it tends to blame kids. And so my question is always, if kids aren't motivated, what are you doing to motivate them? Because not every child is internally motivated. And typically, motivation goes right along with skill. If you don't read well, you're not motivated to continue to do something that's so hard for you. And so improving the outcomes improves motivation and engagement. It changes the mindset. Socioeconomic status also matters. So there are non-language variables that influence reading. The foundation is reading, but if some of these things are present, like you just don't care about reading. That's what we encountered in Oakland. Kids who just didn't want to read, they weren't interested, reading is too hard. But these are 4th to 6th graders who have had years of failure at reading. And so motivation becomes synonymous with failure for them. Why should I keep doing something that I'm not getting any positive gratification from? And so we find that motivation and behavior issues often follow difficulty. They're not just, bad kids who aren't motivated. Not true. Usually it's about their reading levels, and that's what we found in Oakland. And so I gave you a slide about the non-language things. I'm going right back to language. So I'm interested in language variation. And language is not fixed. It evolves across regions and geographic regions, social groups. I like this slide because I didn't actually do it. This is what I was telling Emily. I met with this guy the other day who's like an AI nerd. And so he's telling me about these AI problems. This is Gamma AI. And so I took my presentation and I dropped it into AI. It made beautiful slides. Aren't the slides pretty? It made beautiful slides, and then it reworded some of them because it thinks it's smarter than I am. And a couple of them, I thought, it didn't do that badly with that one. I'm going to leave it. And this is one of them. Language is not monolithic. It evolves and it varies. And it varies depending on who you are and where you live. And so the language in DC is different than actually Baltimore. I have a friend back here, Winifred, who's here, who's from Baltimore, and I sent her this thing that my son sent me from TikTok, where some young men from Baltimore are trying to say, Aaron earned the iron urn. And the whole thing is earn. And it's hilarious. And so language varies not only across cultures, but also across regions. And even in places that are so close, DC and Baltimore, language varies a lot. And language variation is really important to understand when you're talking about reading and writing. And so what is language variation? There are two kinds, and I'm only talking about one of them. Across language variation is what we usually are talking about, and that's bilingualism and multilingualism. So I love being in California because I have a bunch of students who study bilingualism, and we all understand that we're studying language variation, but we're studying different kinds of language variation. So across language variation, we talk about a lot, English learners, bilingual kids, multilingual kids. I'm talking about within language variation. So I'm talking about kids who are bidialectal or multidialectal. So you have the people in Baltimore with that really cool Baltimore accent, and then those who are using the accent also can step out of it and not talk about earn. One of the guys actually tries to do it, and he hyper-articulates so that you can understand what the words mean. But that is a switch, and so he is bidialectal. So within languages, there is a lot of variation in how we produce the same words, regionally, sociolinguistically, and that's what I'm interested in, because those are the kids we don't think about. We know that if you speak Spanish only and I give you an English text, that you are not going to be able to access it unless you learn how to read English. We don't think about that for kids who speak English, that varieties of English influence how you interact with text and whether that text makes sense to you. And that's not something that we account for in teaching often. So within language variation, it's these dialect varieties. I met a woman today whose last name is Washington, and her family is from South Carolina and speak Gullah, which is an incredible variety of English that is quite different from general American English. So if you imagine being 4 years old, coming from a Gullah community into a school where the books are written in general American English, you are going to need help getting from your oral language system to the written system despite the fact that it's English, right? That's what I mean by within language variation. So we have these regional differences. Southern English people always recognize Appalachian English. We have Chicano English, African American English. Gamma AI created this one too. I thought it was very nice. It split them up nicely. I put the information in and it reorganized it. So then we have blended forms like Spanglish, which I wouldn't call it that, but it works. So this is within language variation. There are so many language variants in this country of American English. That is true everywhere. And the more languages there are, the more variants there are. I just came back from Kenya, where they speak 60 different languages. If you imagine that there are 60 languages and every language has at least one dialect, and most have more than one, that there are hundreds of variants of Swahili and the other languages that they speak in that country. And that's true everywhere. Dialects are rule-governed language systems. They're derived from major languages spoken by different groups and communities and regions, and they're everywhere in the world. That's what they are. What they are not is the way we have treated them in our schools. They are not bad English. They are not bad reproductions of English. They are not slang. They are not incorrect. They are rule-governed systems that are spoken by and accepted by members of a community. And so one of the things that we know about dialects, the way that we have talked about them, we talk about language variation now because dialect has become so stigmatized in the way that people talk about it. And depending on the dialect that you speak, you really get stigmatized. For example, we talk about dialects as being high prestige or low prestige. A high prestige dialect is one where when you hear people speak it, you attribute positive characteristics to the speaker. Remember that. The low prestige one is the one where when you hear it, you attribute negative characteristics to the speaker because we conflate people with the way that they talk, right? So what is an example of a high prestige dialect? One where when you hear somebody speak it, you think positive things about them. Don't pretend like you don't do it. Somebody give me an example. Yeah, British English. That's the one everybody says, British English. You hear somebody with a British accent, you think they're high class, they're related to the Queen. That's very high prestige. Yet within high prestige varieties, there are also low prestige varieties, right? So there's Cockney English, which is thought of quite differently, even though it is a British accent. It's a different kind of British accent. It's a variety within British English. What is a high prestige variety in the United States? New England. Yeah, most people say Boston. They're not talking about urban Boston, no. They're talking about the Boston of the Kennedys. Right, exactly. That's the high prestige variety in the United States that people identify most frequently. What's a low prestige variety in the United States? You went for the state. She said Mississippi. Everybody else said Southern English. But it's the same region. Southern English, what do people think when they hear somebody with a Southern accent? Uneducated, slow, wow, biased, redneck, all kinds of things. That is about as negative as you can get when you think about a low prestige variety. I have a friend who has a very pronounced Southern accent. She also has a PhD in statistics, and she won't talk when we go places because of the way people react to her because of her accent. And that is a low prestige variety. So because she has this accent, which is part of your dialect, we think certain things about you and about what your potential is, about what you know, about what your values are. Imagine being 5. We don't suspend those beliefs just because somebody's a kindergartner. We still believe those things about them. I grew up, is anybody here from the South? Yes. I grew up in Seattle. And who? Woo woo. When I was growing up in Seattle, if you moved to the Seattle public schools from the South, you were automatically put back a grade. They didn't test you. They didn't ask you. But if you came from Opelousas, Louisiana, you can't possibly be doing as well as we're doing in Seattle. That's a real bias and prejudice against people who come from a certain region. And often that is driven by the way that we use language. And so dialects reflect our identity, they really do, but sometimes the identity is not created within the group, it's created by people outside of the group. And that's where we tend to see those negative views. So dialects impact every domain of language: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. We don't talk about all of them all the time. We tend to talk more about, like I study African American English, we tend to talk more about phonology, morphology, and syntax, and not as much about semantics and pragmatics. And we have paid for that. I'm working on a grant now, actually, focused on semantic profiles and how semantics differ by culture. And I'm working with a friend of mine who's a colleague, and we're doing Spanish influenced English and African American English. Because one of the things we know is that in the reading research, everybody's vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. If you don't have a good vocabulary, it reflects your background knowledge, and you're going to have trouble learning to read. But what we have learned in kids who come from other cultures, African American kids, Spanish speaking kids, the problem with vocabulary is not background knowledge, it's naming. So you have a bunch of kids who don't know the names of things, but if you ask them what it is, they'll tell you. They know what it is, they know what it's for, they don't know what it's called. And we see that my colleague Elizabeth Pena wrote a paper that said naming is a cultural value. Some cultures name everything. White mothers, y'all name everything. It's a chair. This is a chair. See the chair? Oh, the chair is blue. The black mother, sit down. So the kids learn the function of the chair. That's the thing you sit down in. That's what the kids tell us instead of the name of things. And so it is a cultural value. We are not naming everything, but our kids know what it is. But if you thought about semantics, that the vocabulary issue that you're seeing is in naming and not background knowledge. Wouldn't you teach it differently? You'd focus on teaching the names. It makes it a lot easier to teach. It's one of the things we see all the time. We have a picture from a standardized test that has a fire hydrant in it. And without fail, most of our kids call it a fire water holder. That's exactly what it is. And so they tend to describe the function, and then we have to teach them the name. But that is very different than saying about those kids, they don't have background knowledge. They do. What they don't have is the name. That is the difficulty of not paying attention to cultural issues across languages, is that you underestimate kids. Everybody speaks a dialect. So many people think they don't. That's the irony of all of the negativity around dialect. This is the ugliest map ever. However, it shows everybody in this room speaks some kind of dialect. If you're from this country or any other country you do, this is the map of the United States. These are the dialects across the United States by region. I'm from Seattle. That's the Pacific Northwest dialect. We are in DC. What, is that North Midland? Which one are you? What number? Number 12, yeah, North Midland, and 11. So that's the way that the dialect that's spoken here is labeled by linguists, right? So we have all these dialects by region, and even within regions, there are some real special places. Anybody here from Louisiana? Louisiana is dialect central. Number 24, it's the king, queen, prince, and princess of dialect. There are so many dialects in Louisiana that despite the fact they're in the Gulf Southern region, they get their own region. The same is true for some cities. New York City has its own, so does Chicago, so does San Francisco, Boston. So within the New England dialect, there's also the Bostonian variety. Within the Bostonian variety, there are all the other varieties that are spoken by people who live there. So if you live in Boston, you probably speak the New England dialect, you speak the Boston dialect. If you're black, you also got African American English. If you're educated, you also have General American English. That's what we mean by multi-dialectal. You can speak many, many different dialects, just like you can speak many languages. The difference is you often don't know when you're speaking them. You just go in and out of them depending on who you're talking to. So why do we care about language variation? Because every child brings their community's language to school with them. It's the syntax, the semantics, the morphology, all of it comes to school with them. And by the time they enter classrooms, they're experts in that language system. When you get to school, the classroom is a different system. And so you're learning General American English. We used to call it Standard English. Got away from that because that assumes that other versions are non-standard. They're not. It's a continuum of dialect use. There's a general system that's used in education, commerce, and the media. And the media depends on where you are. Because if you're in the mountains in Kentucky, they are using their own dialect, even with the media. But those are the places that we tend to see that in education, in media, and in commerce. And then there's the community languages that are also on that continuum. So when kids get to school, they have spent 4 to 5 years interacting with people who are all using the same system. So they've learned how to use it. They've learned what's allowed and what's not allowed. In fact, one of the things that we're talking about in this grant that we're doing is using the community as informants. Because a lot of the things we tend to believe about the way language is used, they didn't have any input in that decision that we made. And so we think their kids aren't using language well, and the community thinks they're using it fine. Or we think that the kids are using it fine, but within that community system, parents say, she can't do that very well. And so there's the standard that we have set for kids, and then there's the standard that they have in their community. And we need to know both in order to do things that are really good for kids. Language is really tied to our culture. and understanding that relationship is really important for literacy development. We're finding that with our assessments. We just published a paper in the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research focused on syntax in African American kids. So that's sentence structure, and we're focused on complex syntax. We give kids a language test, complex syntax, and they fail this test. And the kids are functioning like a standard deviation below the mean, which is low. And then we add dialect into our model, and everybody goes up to the mean and above. So when we consider their own language system and how they're using that language system to respond to these items on these instruments, then we know what they actually know. And I gave these examples at this conference in Big Sky, Montana, of this instrument that we used. I love it because of the way the kids respond. So it's called a sentence combining test. So the job of the kids is I give you two sentences, and the instructions you get are, I'm going to give you two sentences. You need to combine them into one sentence and make the sentence shorter and more efficient, right? So one of my favorite items is Julie is very large. Sheila is very large. And what the kids say is, Sheila and Julie both real big. and so we get that they understood the task, but they didn't actually do it right. So that one is wrong. But what we get with kids is they do it, but they change the words because they would never say very large in their own language system. And so they say, Julie and who else's name did I use? Yours, Sheila. Julie and Sheila are very large. Julie and Sheila are big. Julie and Sheila are bigger than their friends, and that kind of stuff. So they interpret it, and those are wrong. So we end up on the instrument they are, so we end up with the kids finishing and sealing out really fast on the instrument. So their score is low. My question is, why is it wrong? What was the goal of the test? Was it for you to repeat the words exactly or to combine the ideas? Did they combine them and make them a shorter, more efficient sentence? They did, so it should be right. The focus, me and Sheila weren't the point. The point was combining them to make it more efficient, and almost every kid did that. But they got them wrong because they changed the words. There's one that's, it's the very first item. I like milk, I like ice cream. What do you combine? How do you combine that? I like what? Dairy. You got it wrong. I like milk and ice cream. What the kids say is, not me. I like cookies and milk. And so the whole test looks like that. And the items are counted wrong, but they are not wrong because the kids understood the instructions and they did what the instructions asked. But they also turned it into discourse. And it's like they're having a conversation with you. I said to one kid, this is not a conversation. Just do what I told you to do. And she's like, okay. And then she did the rest of them exactly the same way. That's a really cultural approach to answering those questions that we don't honor on instruments. So language and culture are so tied, and in kids we see it. They don't just repeat what you said, they respond to what you said. And that's not what the instruments are looking for. So we can either teach them how to take a test, or we can change the way that the test scores what their response is. So our task as educators is to view this language expertise as a strength, affirm children's language, and integrate it into our teaching when we teach reading and writing. So we need to take their language expertise and integrate it into our literacy instruction. I'm going to skip that one. So in language variation and reading, one of the things we know is that teaching kids to read whose language is different from the language of the classroom introduces a level of complexity for them. So they are looking at text that's quite different from the way that they use language, but they still have to be able to read it the way that it's written and get meaning from it. And there are some extra steps involved in that. And so it can complicate any language-based task. This is the mismatch hypothesis from 1969. See how old that is? Old. We've been talking about this forever. It's been hypothesized that the mismatch between the language spoken at home and the one used at school increases the cognitive load, making the process of learning to read harder. So for a while, I was at the University of Wisconsin, and Mark Seidenberg is a cognitive psychologist who is a computational modeler. So he develops these theoretical models to test hypotheses. And so I asked him, can we develop a conceptual model or a computational model that tests the mismatch hypothesis? Because we've been talking about it forever, but we've never actually been able to test it in an objective way. So he said yes. And so we took data from kids that I had in my samples, and we dropped it into these models. And the question we were trying to answer with the model was, if you have oral language and text that match or don't match, how does the model respond? And so we had spelling and pronunciation is what we used as oral and written. When the spelling and the pronunciation matched, it took the model approximately 350 trials to get to 75% accuracy. So it had to be exposed to these exemplars 350 times, and then it got it with 75% accuracy. That's when they matched. When the spelling and the pronunciation didn't match, it took more than 1,000 trials for the model to get to 75% accuracy. That's what we are concerned about with kids. They need more practice, they need more access, they need more exposure to print and oral language before they are actually going to get it and become good readers. And there are teachers in this room, is that what they're getting? No. I remember No Child Left Behind. I used to say, leave every child behind. That's what we're doing. We're moving so fast, and we're not paying attention to the needs of specific populations of kids. And for kids who are using a language system that differs from text, even when it's English and the text is English, they need more time, more opportunity to engage with text in order to master it. And this was the study that finally proved it for us in an objective way. So, that being the case, the way that people have responded to it is, to date, is we need to go in then, well, if the mismatch between the text and oral language is a problem, we need to change the way the kids talk and get the oral language to match the text. And there have been a lot of these interventions and approaches to classroom teaching that are focused on code switching. Teach the kids to switch codes, use the language of text, and they'll be better readers. Guess what? Doesn't work. People have been trying it, it doesn't work because it also makes it harder. At the same time that you are learning to do something that Louisa Moats calls rocket science. Teaching reading is rocket science, and so is learning to read. At the same time that you're learning to do that, we're removing the language at which you are expert and telling you to use this one instead. And guess what? We don't create readers that way. And so the kids are taking their resources, those cognitive resources, focusing on something that's not reading at the same time that they're trying to learn how to read. And so those things have not worked. Not only have they not worked, but I was interested to hear you say, Emily, because I didn't know that you originally got interested in this because of college students. And one of the things that I learned, I'm in California now, but I was in Atlanta at Georgia State. My African American students, when I would talk about dialect, would get really, it was triggering because they had been in school and everybody's telling them, you don't talk that way, that's bad English, all these things. And so what happens to those kids? Silent. It silences them. So I'm watching these young people while I'm talking about this, and afterward when I opened it for Q&A, one of the students said, I didn't know that what I was doing was a thing. I just thought it was wrong. And I said, why did you think it was wrong? Who told you it was wrong? Who told her it was wrong? Her teacher. Teachers. It's wrong. One student told me that her teacher used to make her put a pencil between her teeth so she could talk better. I was like, wow. So I'm one of these, I believe that teachers need to take the same oath that doctors take, do no harm. That is harmful. That is very harmful to kids. And I learned it from college students, that you're 25, 22 years old, you're already in college, and you still have all this trauma related to the way that people responded to your language. Then I went to Richmond with Margaret Goldberg, and we were talking to teachers, professional development, and there was an older man from the community in his 70s. And we talked about this, and he started crying. He's in his 70s. He said, I'm so glad to hear somebody say that the things that we do in our community are okay. And so this idea of having kids come in and saying, wrong, you have to do it this way, has not worked. Not only has it harmed them from a social emotional standpoint, it also complicates reading. And so we're talking about translanguaging as a different way to think about this. So it has its origins in bilingualism, and it's the idea that when kids come to school, you allow them to use their full linguistic repertoire to support learning these language-based tasks. So if I'm using Appalachian English, I get to use the way that I use English to make sense of text. I have to use my own language to make sense of what's going on. And so it's not just code switching, it's the idea of sort of this fluid movement across systems that kids are doing, and they do it as they need to do it. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So translanguaging allows bidialectal students. That's what we're doing now. Bilingualism's been talking about this for a while. Now we're talking about it in bidialectalism. And children pragmatically use both their languages in order to maximize performance anyway. We know that about language, and now we know it about dialect as well. So this is one of my favorite researchers in translanguaging. His name is Leketi Makalela. He's in Johannesburg at the University of Witwatersrand. And you might know that South Africa has 6 languages, 12 official languages, right? I think it's 13 now. Last year they added sign language, which good for them. And so they have all these languages that come into their classrooms from different villages across the country. And he looked at translanguaging practices that students use naturally to support their learning. And in this classroom that he highlighted, students spoke 6 different languages. And so he had a problem-solving task for them, and he told the class to break up into groups, solve the problem, and then come back to the whole classroom and talk about their process. And what he observed was that students automatically separated themselves into language groups. He didn't need to say anything, but they found the other kids who spoke Zulu. Even though it's an English-speaking class, they found the kids who spoke Zulu, they found the Xhosa kids, they found the Sepedi kids. They got together in their groups, used their language to do the problem solving. So he could hear all this Zulu being spoken over here, Sepedi's being spoken over here. This group doesn't know what that group is saying, but they're all solving this problem. And then when they came back together at the end of this task, they switched to English and told him what their process was. And his finding was that which I love, his conclusion was that one language is incomplete without the other one. So you need both of them to do your problem solving, because one of them is your natural language, the one that you think in, the one that you've been learning in since the day you came onto this earth, and the other one is the one you taught me. So I was in South Africa before the pandemic. I think that's my life now. It's BP and AP, before the pandemic and after the pandemic. Sometime before the pandemic, I was in South Africa in a rural environment. We were working with these kids, and we were doing a camp. The camp was focused on improving self-efficacy for going to college. So of course, I was doing the communication piece. So, you know, in your own environment, you use communication in a certain way, and I'm like, this is the way we use it in college, so we're gonna talk about how to be critical thinkers, how to be critical of other people when they're talking in a way that's respectful. So at the end, I said, I taught them how to give speeches, how to get up and talk, survey the room, move your hands, without this, and all the things that they would naturally do. And so at the end, I said, I want you to do we're going to have a competition. This is the thing you have to memorize. Get up, do a speech using all the things that you've learned this week. And whoever does it well, and your peers are going to decide who did it the best, that's the person who wins. So the first person who got up was a little girl. She's 11 years old. She stood up and she looked at me and said, I need to do it in my language first. I said, okay. She did the whole speech in Sepedi, which was her home language, and then she said, now I can do it, and then she did the whole thing perfectly in English. She needed her own language to support her ability to do it in the language that the school had taught her. And so this idea that one language is complete without the other is because they support each other. They support each other and they support children's learning. So this is the project. This is my last thing. I think I'm over time. But Project Stellar, now I write what it means because I can never remember. Statistical learning and translanguaging in education, leveraging language assets for reading. And so the goal was to go in, honor what kids already know. These are 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. So the inclusion criteria for the study was 2nd grade reading level, because these are kids who are struggling with reading. We just need for you to be able to read words. And our goal is to teach you to put those words together fluently to make meaning in 8 weeks. Okay, so this is an 8-week program, 3 days a week for an hour and a half for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. And so our goal was to create a supplemental program that leverages African American English. We want you to use language the way you use it to improve your reading fluency. In our translanguaging approaches, it's okay for you to use whatever language you need in order to support learning. The overall concept is leveraging language and using language to teach reading. So we start with reading, with language. Everything starts with language. So we started with oral language. We had a topic. We talked about the topic. We talked about the books. We talked about everything, and then we read. And in the process of doing that, though, we want you to pay attention to your oral fluency. We want you to pay attention to the way you use pitch, the way you're using stress, timing. Those are essential elements of verbal communication. Guess what? That's also reading fluency. So if we can get you to be more meta-linguistic about the way you're using it in oral language, we're going to transfer it to writing. That was the goal. And so the kids were like, okay, the girls were funny. They're like, well, you know, when we talk, we do this, and we do it like this. And I said, okay, well, do that when you read. And she's like, okay. And so, but it's this idea that it's okay for me to do this and that it's going to help me. And so in the intervention, we put together 19 lessons with 7 units that we presented over time. The kids really helped us put them together. They helped us pick the topics, actually. Some kids before the intervention, like our first topic was the ocean, because we live in California. And one of the 12-year-old boys said, we don't care nothing about the ocean. Like, oh, okay. So we changed the lesson to be more culturally appropriate. And culturally appropriate in this case, these kids are African American, but they're also teenagers and preteens. And so that's part of the culture also. Doing things that are appropriate. Even if you read at a low level, you don't want to talk about Peppa Pig. You want to talk about something you care about and that's appropriate for you at your age. So engaging text, things that kids would find interesting and enjoyable, those were the requirements. A lot of practice, that's what we did in these sessions. A lot of practice talking and reading and spending time on the same elements over the course of 8 weeks in things that were engaging and drawing and doing whatever kids needed to do. So we were connecting oral and written language for them because our hypothesis was everybody in this room knows that oral language and writing are connected, but we didn't think any of the kids did. We didn't think they had any idea that the way you talk and writing have anything to do with each other. In fact, kids who struggle think that reading is like math, just hard. And some people are good at it and some people aren't. And that's what they told us. And so when we said, as much as you talk and as creative as you are with the way you use language, it is not clear why you're not reading. We need to take what you know orally and transfer it to the way that you read. And it was news to them that the way they talked and what they were doing on paper probably could be very similar. So this was our first lesson, and the kids chose this. Good trouble. That's what one of them told me. We want to study good trouble. So we chose John Lewis because he's good trouble. And so our first theme was influence. We said influence. And the kids said, no, influencers. Like, okay. So the first lessons became about influencers. And the first one was John Lewis. So we talked about who John Lewis was, what he was doing. And then we had a lesson grabber, an anchoring video, something they could relate to. Has anybody ever heard Cardi B talk? Yes. And she talks about in this clip that she talks that way because she knows that it grabs people, but that she can switch. And so the kids were really into, and I would play this clip if it would actually play, but I don't think it will. But Cardi B talks to her about using her fame to influence change, and she knows that the way that she uses language influences people, and she talks to them about it. And so the kids were really interested in that. And once we have the lesson grabber, then we turn and talk about what the topics are. Talk to your partner. Listen to people's voices, make connections. We gave them some conversation starters. We thought they would need them. They didn't actually. They'd like to talk. They talked a lot. And one of the things they said to us was, we get to talk? They don't usually let us talk. I'm like, no, talking is really important here. We're going to start with talking. And I don't understand how we can know that language supports reading and yet classrooms are silent. You want a reader, let them talk. And so we did a lot of talking and talking about how to talk. And so those are some of the conversation starters. And then these were our rituals. All voices are important. Get to know your classmates using language. Listen and make connections. Listen and add information. Listen and give a response. And connection with oral language. Then we switch to the text. So we talked about oral fluency, what it is, what you're doing with it. Match the meaning of the words to the way that you're using the words. And that's what reading fluency is. And so once kids understood what fluency was in oral language, then we switched to reading. So you follow. This is what we did. I read, we read, y'all read. I don't know if anybody's met Carla. She's one of my doctoral students. She's from Georgia, and I love Carla because y'all, I love y'all. It's one of my favorite words because it's very succinct. But she used to do with younger kids. When she had kids who wanted to say something who were in preschool, she said, now if you want to talk, you have to tell us that you want to talk about something. And the way that they started the conversation was, y'all know what? And then it means you get to talk. So in Oakland, we also did y'all read. And it means you follow and you read all the words while the teacher listens. So the kids read, we read, they read silently. It was just reading, a lot of practice with reading because that's what that study told us they needed. And so this is an example of the text. First read the words exactly and with punctuation. So once we move from oral to written language, we want you to pay attention to all the words. We don't want you to miss them. You got the meaning in oral language. Now let's do it in writing. Use appropriate feelings, and your classmates are helping you figure out whether you're doing it. Use the appropriate speed, use pitch, and read using all the qualities of fluency, because remember, this was about fluency. One of the things we know about fluency is if you don't understand the text, you don't read it fluently, that you don't read with feeling. You don't use the right pitch. You ignore the punctuation. And so we really focused on how important those were. And at the end of 8 weeks, we saw 4th, 5th, and 6th graders make significant progress in their fluency on the Woodcock-Johnson, and more than we actually expected. The kids who showed up the most, of course, made the most progress. But we saw kids moving from the dark one was when we started. The light green colored one was at the end of 8 weeks, and we We have gone back, and I haven't looked at that data yet to see whether they maintained those gains 2 months later. And it looked like they did, and we're going to start with them again and then teach teachers how to do this. But it really worked. We measured their fluency, which was our goal. But one of the things that we really liked was what they learned about language and reading and how they saw themselves as readers really changed. Even their parents said, we went to the store and I told her she could buy something and she bought a book. And it's like, yay. So once they saw themselves as readers, then that thing about motivation and engagement changes because I can read. I have become a reader. I learned that using my oral language helped me by not being uncomfortable. I'm just talking how I usually talk, and I like that. That's what we wanted. How does language help you with reading? I used to read books so dry that they wouldn't have that much punctuation or fluency. But once I got into Stellar, I learned that I needed to add punctuation, and now when I read books, it sounds more understandable. So it wasn't just reading individual words. They were having to integrate, make connections with feeling. And they learned how to do it. That inner voice helps me to understand what I'm reading out loud because my inner voice can make connections from the book into a real life. And it can, based on what I'm reading, it helped me to, know what fluency decisions to use. And so we learned it in oral language first, then we transferred it to books. And we really saw kids, they really liked it. We called it a book club. So the lessons learned were that oral language is a superpower. That's what the kids said, and we said that often, and they internalized it. Oral fluency and strong language skills are essential. Students learn key skills like inference, we really worked on that, fluency, and the effective use of language pauses and emphasis that you can use when you read. So we made the connection between oral language and written language for them. And students felt empowered when they could use their natural ways of speaking without discomfort. So they were more confident. And they get to take all the books home and create a library. So inner voices guide comprehension. That's what we learned from these guys, that once we started talking about what your inner voice was, how you should pay attention to it when you're reading, practicing oral reading with attention to punctuation and expression, a lot of practice. This is not during the reading block, we read for 15 minutes. They got a lot of practice with books and reading at topics that we went over background words and talked about how words change, the morphology of words, added all of that, and then discuss readings with peers to deepen understanding and build critical thinking skills. So language led. That's the big thing. We led with language, and leading with oral language helped kids to put it all together. So embracing students' language abilities can foster inclusivity and empower their learning environments. Multiple language practices, teachers help students build confidence, deepen their understanding. And that's the goal, is for kids to understand what they read. If you were reading books every day and you didn't understand what it meant, why would you keep reading? And that's it. This is my team. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, I get to sit.
Right here, you get to sit.
Okay, short people sitting on high chairs is not cute. So don't pay attention to how I get up here. I'm good.
Did you see Trump?
This is what happens.
Truck the other day.
Yeah. This is what happens when I go to a restaurant and you sit in the high chairs.
Right.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I am so glad that we brought you here. You're such an excellent communicator of these very important ideas.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Let's give her another round of applause. I want to get pretty quickly to the audience questions because I don't think we have that much time.
No, I'm sorry.
It's okay because we all love listening to you talk. So many key takeaways in there, I think, for all of us. A few things that really stood out to me. Dialects are not bad reproductions of major languages, nor are they slang or incorrect, undesirable forms of language. Really important. This teaching reading to children whose language differs from the oral language of the classroom adds an additional layer of complexity to reading instruction. That is one of the big key takeaways that I took when I first heard you talking about your work. That just really helped me understand something about the distance between the words of the text and the words that students are bringing, the language that they're bringing to the classroom. So, and the other thing that really stuck out to me that I'd love to talk to you more about, but this mismatch between the language system spoken at home and the one used at school increases the cognitive load. I've been thinking a lot about this cognitive load issue. It shows up in a lot of ways in terms of how schools are teaching reading, and I think that is one example, but there are others
That's
where
right.
we're sort of like putting, not teaching it in a way that's the most sort of maximally efficient in terms of what is the most important thing for this kid to be sort of learning right now so that they can get to the end goal, understanding what they read.
And cognitive load theory calls that an extraneous load. And we create a lot of extraneous loads in teaching. The things that don't take kids directly to the task that we're trying to teach them. And I think when we look at what we're doing, if you're trying to teach a language task, focus on language. If you're trying to teach a reading task, focus on reading and not necessarily language. If you want to focus on language, then do a language task. Do something with language, but don't necessarily force kids to be focused on two different things. That old thing about kids can't walk and chew gum at the same time, absolutely true. That's a cognitive load issue.
Yeah.
And we see it in language development, that if you have a child who is 2.5 or 3 years old, and is learning how to ride a tricycle, we see language stop until you have mastered the motor task. If you're trying to learn to climb a tree, all your effort is going into that tree, and you're not going to talk while you're doing that. And so we see these points in language development that we call language explosions, where kids just have this big explosive language growth, and it usually follows a lull in language because they were focused on something that was motoric. Yeah. And so that's that cognitive load issue.
Yeah, that's big. It's a big one to address. So when I first met you, I was deep in the weeds of trying to understand the influence of the whole language movement. And that movement was deeply suspicious of phonics instruction. And I think a big reason for that had to do with language variation. So the idea there was that if you were going to honor language variation and dialect, you shouldn't or you couldn't teach phonics. That honoring language variation and teaching kids to decode words were at odds. I think that was something that was really deeply in the whole language movement. And then I remember hearing you talk about your work when we were in Mississippi, and you were on stage with Mark Seidenberg, cognitive scientist Mark Seidenberg, talking about the critical role of decoding and the importance of honoring and valuing language variation.
Yep.
So I'm just kind of curious, can you say more about that, how you understand what the whole language movement sort of was about, what it got right and what it got wrong? Yeah.
Well, I do not believe that teaching kids to break the code dishonors their dialect. It dishonors them as students when you don't teach them how to break the code. And so you have to teach phonics because it is the basis of reading. And it's something that kids have to know. But the thing that we do that dishonors them is that if you have the word with, and the final sound in with is TH, and the child who speaks a dialect pronounces it in oral language as whiff, that's not wrong. It's variation. And so what you're doing is adding to what they already know. Yeah. You're extending what they know.
Right.
And so the thing that dishonored them was believing that what we were doing was replacing something they were doing wrong with something that we wanted them to do right. Uh-huh. But instead, they already have a sound for that TH at the end of a word, and you're adding a new one, and it's the one that you use in print.
Right.
Because the one they use in oral language is F, and that's cool. But in writing, you need to add the TH. The other thing it got wrong, actually is something we're getting wrong again, I think, is the science of reading is really, like right now, focused at the word level, and we're really focused on phonics and phonological awareness. Even the language focus is single word because it's vocabulary. And That is necessary, but it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient to make readers, and that's what we saw with these kids. I call them word callers. That's what we're creating. Kids who can read words, read them fluently, read them when they're single syllable or multi-syllables. I got this word. I don't really know what it means. I don't really know how to use it in a sentence. I can't recognize it and relate to it in text. And so at every point in our history, I think with reading, we have been so focused on one piece of it to the exclusion of the other piece.
And
we
why?
have to
Why can't
put
we
it. Why can't we
walk
put
and
it all
chew gum
together?
at the same
Exactly,
time?
exactly.
But really, I'm actually serious. Why?
You know, I think we tend to throw, as a country actually, and certainly in reading research, is we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We find that something isn't working for, like teaching phonics and teaching phonological awareness isn't helping with reading comprehension. So instead of adding reading comprehension, we throw out phonics and phonological awareness.
Yeah, we
and
think
then
that
go,
was the problem. Without
exactly.
saying it just wasn't enough.
Exactly. Instead of understanding that those things are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Yeah. So how do we need to extend them so that we, at the end of it all, kids are fluent and comprehending? Because all these kids could read words. It was a requirement. If they can read words, we can teach them to integrate those words by giving them more practice, more instruction, and more focus on books with their oral language attached to that. And I just think we see a problem in one area and we throw out the other area. No, that part's really important, but it can't be the only thing we do, which is what whole language did. It's all about that. And that idea that you're dishonoring a child's dialect by teaching them to do something that you know they have to learn in another system is criminal.
Keeping something from them.
Yeah, it is. You're disadvantaging them. Yeah. And so you dishonor them by telling them what they're doing is wrong, and you honor them by teaching them the thing that they need to know in order to read.
Yeah. I want to ask you one question about dyslexia and poverty in particular, and then we're going to open it up to everyone else. This is something we talked about at length in the interview that we did a few years ago. And one of the things you said to me was, we've decided as a country that if you're having trouble reading and you're poor, you're having trouble with reading because you're poor.
Yeah.
Because our policy does not allow you to be both learning disabled and poor. Can you explain that?
Yes. So happy to. Because right now, I was at IDA last week, the International Dyslexia Association Conference, and they're working on a new definition for dyslexia. My concern with that is that they create this definition, the one that they're using in private schools and that they're using in research, but the one that the federal government has that gets you services in a public school never changes. And it never reflects that one. There's a big gap between those two. And the public school definition, the one in the IDEA, has exclusionary criteria. So dyslexia falls under specific learning disabilities in our special ed law, SLD. And you can get a diagnosis of SLD unless, and this is in the law, unless your learning problems are due to culture, socioeconomic status, or language. And so that means that you hardly ever see kids with the dyslexia label who are Black or Latino. Anybody who is, will you turn that off, please? I'm sorry. You know the sound is not on, but your kids can call you. Oh, even when the sound, I got to unset that. But,
so those are your sons.
Yeah,
calling.
That's my son. And so I'm like, stop. But so it is the case that the law says that. And so I don't think that's what it meant to do, but it is what it has done in practice. Yeah. So if you say you can't be called SLD if it's due to socioeconomic status, then it makes it easy for us to say you don't have dyslexia, you're poor, and you can't read because you're impoverished. And so it's created this big bias and gap in the country about who is called dyslexic and who's not. Wanda, what's her name? She's the dean, Wanda Blanchett is the dean of education at Rutgers. And she calls dyslexia the diagnosis of privilege for the privileged. And that is what it looks like, that the kids who are most likely to have that label are white and upper middle class. And kids who are even middle class and in public school are very unlikely to get that diagnosis, and that was created by the exclusion criteria in the law. And so my view is, like everything else, the law needs to change. The wording needs to change. It needs to reflect what we actually know to be true. But instead of doing that, this is one of my pet peeves, and they have me on, so you shouldn't have asked me. But now they have me on the definition committee, and I told them, you know, I'm not going to work on a private school definition with you. This is ridiculous. We keep doing this, coming up with this definition that is research-driven and evidence-based, but only exists at IDA and in research, and does not benefit kids who are in public schools. We are contributing to the problem over and over and over again by continuing to do it that way and not lobbying for the special ed law to be updated. It needs to be reauthorized. It hasn't been reauthorized since 2007. We know so much more about reading, you know that, in the last 10 years, and that's not reflected in the law. And so we are treating poor kids like you can't read because you're poor, and we never identify dyslexia. So my study, the Learning Disabilities Innovation Hub, the research question was, in a population of kids for whom 8 out of 10 struggle with reading, how do you identify reading disabilities and including dyslexia? And the answer is you don't with our current instruments, because poverty and disability look exactly the same on language and reading assessments.
Yeah, and you can think about how that plays out in a school where
exactly.
8 out of 10 kids
they look
are
exactly
with
the same.
reading. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what questions do you have? There's Caitlin in the beautiful orange dress has the microphone. Here's a question right here.
Hi.
Hi.
I am a reading interventionist in DC Public Schools, so before I ask my question, just thank you for what you just spoke about, because that's very much my life
It's your
professionally.
life, yes.
So I work mostly with primary age students, so very focused on decoding and the phoneme grapheme correspondence that they need to crack the code. But so I grew up in upstate New York, and that little tiny sliver of Western New England dialect. And as I've become more aware of how that can influence my teaching and influence how I interact with my students whose dialect is different now that I live in DC, I've noticed that I'm very nasalized in my vowels, and I have a lot of, they're very whiny, and especially when I teach A and E, the example that came to my mind is man and men. When I have my students decode that, I am expecting it to sound a certain way, and I'm like, wait, but do they have it? And so I have to be like, okay, well, how many are there, guys? Like, to make sure that they know the word that they're reading. So I guess my question is, what are practical strategies for me as a practitioner to use as I work to build my students' connections between their speech and the print when we have a dialectal difference between us?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had a teacher in Cincinnati ask me that, because she came from the South and moved to Cincinnati. And she said that she was teaching her kids, sound symbol correspondence, and she said they kept doing it wrong. But then she noticed that they were all doing the same thing, and she realized it was her. So instead of saying ice, she said ass, and the kids were writing it ass. And, and so she really had to go back and change the way that she was saying it. It's kind of like that Baltimore tape that I was talking about, where you had this one guy who was hyper-articulating to make sure that you understood what he was saying, and he said it the way he meant to say it. And I do think that as a teacher, especially when you're teaching phonemic awareness, you have to get it right and practice it in order for your kids to get it. That year when we were in Mississippi, I had a professor who was talking to me about, she says ax instead of ask, which is common in African-American English, but ax is also a separate word.
Right.
And so she said that she still can't hear the difference, but she trained her tongue so that she can feel the difference. Yeah. Because after a while, your perception is set. and you are not really going to be able to hear it, but you still have to change it.
And it also gets to the bi-directional. This is, there's a decent
Yes.
amount of phonemic awareness practice going on and on in schools without letters, and you can think this is a place where letters is so important. Don't do it without letters. The letters help.
Yep.
Because understanding with and with, you just have to understand, okay, I say it with, and it's spelled with, and so the kids need to see those letters, and you start
That's right.
to learn that.
That's right. Absolutely.
That's
But
a great question.
it is a great
Thank
question.
you.
Your dialect matters.
Okay, next. There's a question right here.
Hi, I'm a first grade teacher in DC Public Schools, and I was really interested in what you talked about with students being able to talk in their own language and with students who speak just like them, and then they're able to bring it to, like that allows them to engage more deeply in the task. Do you recommend, like when I partner students together, that they are partnered with students who speak either the same language as them or the same dialect as them? Because I have a lot of different languages and dialects in my classroom.
As long as you're not doing something that makes kids feel stigmatized, because teachers
Right.
can do that.
Yeah, that's what I don't want to do.
And so one of the nice things about Makalela was he allowed them to do it on their own. And I saw that actually at Georgia State in my lab. I hire, in order to do my language or my statistical coding, I hire students who are accounting majors because they don't make mistakes. Speech pathologists make a lot of mistakes when they're coding numbers, but accountants don't. And it turned out that most of our accounting students were Chinese. And I was telling them what to do, and they weren't getting it. And one of the young ladies who was part of that group said, "Just a minute, can I handle this?" And I said, "Yes." And she turned around and she told them what to do in Chinese. And they all turned around and said, "Oh, okay, now we know what to do." And so even though they were English speakers, fluent English speakers, when you start talking about deep thinking and critical thinking, students need to be able to do it in their own system, whatever that is. And so you don't necessarily have to group them, but don't suppress them. And that's one of the things that, we're not suppressing dialect, we're extending their language system to include the language of text, but we are not suppressing the system that you brought with you.
How are we doing on time? I left my...
Are we going to get kicked out?
I left my phone in my coat, which is back there. What time is it?
11:33.
Okay, let's take one more question then. We got one more
There's a
question.
lady way back in the back who's had her
Okay.
hand up for a
Okay.
while. I'm sorry I'm not doing your job for you,
No, that's
but
okay.
I saw
Yeah.
her.
Thank you. My name is Andrea, and I'm a community-based educator. I've worked in after-school programs, and I'm really curious about if there's been any research or observations looking at the historical context of Black students reading, maybe like during Reconstruction or during civil rights eras where there were majority environments where the educators were also the folks who understood the dialects, understood the nuances of
That
linguistics,
is such a good question.
and how students were able to learn how to read, and advance in education, and what we see today with the differences of the impact of when you're not in a majority environment, whether it's Black, whether it's Latino, Asian, and how that impacts your foundational experience with learning how to read.
That is such a good question, and it's not going to be the answer you expect. Of all the people who object to what we're talking about with translanguaging, the people who are most likely to object are Black, actually, because of the historical consequences of not being able to use mainstream American or general American English. And so what we see is, like, my mother and my grandmother were teachers in East Texas. My mother was quick to say, "We only speak the Queen's English in this house." And teachers were doing the same thing. And it's exactly what we see with English learners, where when we start talking about translanguaging and allowing kids to use their home language to support reading, the parents are the ones who are most likely to object, because English is the language of power. And in the same way, my mother and my grandmother saw General American English as the language of power. And so you need to learn to use this system. So they weren't necessarily supporting it, but what they were doing was giving kids practice and loving or beating them through it until they got it, right? So my mother said to me when I started studying African American English, the more education you get, the worse you talk. And because I was using dialect more freely. But I do think that one of the things we saw historically in those early schools was a real push to use the language of power because we were trying to move out of the community and do things that we wanted to do in a larger way. So there wasn't always a lot of support for it. But what we did see, the linguistic part was not necessarily always supported, but the cultural part was always there. And there are people like Goldie Muhammad, who goes back to the way that we were reading before we got here. And reading is so important, such a powerful tool in terms of thinking, learning, and moving around in the world. As soon as we got here as slaves, it's the first thing they stopped us from doing because they didn't want us to think. Black people, African people didn't come here without literacy. We were highly literate. Yeah. The societies were highly literate, and it was the first thing they took away because it meant you cannot enslave someone who can think and read. And so once they stopped us from reading, then we could be enslaved. But in the presence of reading, there's way too much thinking going on, and you can't enslave me. In South Africa, what they suppressed was language. So they put them into townships based on the language that they spoke, and that's how all those different languages developed. And so they couldn't talk to each other. And so when you want somebody to be oppressed, keep them from reading and keep them from using language. And so we came here as a highly literate people, and our literacy was suppressed in order to control us. And then we came back during the Reconstruction, and there are a lot of data that people are talking about now. Came back during the Reconstruction, regained our literacy skills that we brought back from Africa. 90% of the Black community could read during the Reconstruction, and that's when the Ku Klux Klan came along because they needed for us not to be reading. And then we became who we are today in terms of the reading struggle. So this is not without political nuance, and it's not even that nuanced. This is not without political influence that we are in where we are today with reading. And so some of that pride in being readers in our community was lost in all this historical back and forth about whether we were allowed to read or not. We need to regain it. And that's actually Goldie's focus. She's at the University of Illinois, Chicago, trying to regain the literacy that we had and the literary societies that were a part of who we were before we came to this country.
Well, that is a good way to end. Thank you all so much for coming this morning. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.